Hallelujah, praise Yah, Shabbat Shalom. Hell's gates fail against the Sabbath keepers of church history is the topic of the day. Stay tuned as we get started here.
Transformation. The change from Sabbath to Sunday, a transformation that shook the foundations of faith and reshaped the landscape of Christianity. But how did it happen? And more importantly, why? The answer lies in the corridors of power in ancient Rome. Picture this. It's the year 321 AD. Constantine the Great, the first Roman emperor to profess Christianity, issues an edict. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells us, the earliest recognition of the observance of Sunday as a legal duty is a constitution of Constantine in 321 AD, enacting that all courts of justice, inhabitants of towns and workshops were to be at rest on Sunday, venerabili die solis. But what did this edict actually say? Let's hear it in Constantine's own words. Let all the judges and town people in the occupation of all trades rest on the venerable day of the sun. But let those who are situated in the country, freely and at full liberty, attend to the business of agriculture. Notice something peculiar? This law doesn't mention the Sabbath or even Christianity. It speaks of the venerable day of the sun, a clear nod to the pagan sun worship that was still prevalent in the empire. This wasn't a Christian law.
Sabbath history. Get started with the Aaronic blessing song.
Shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you, and he will give you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you, and he will give you peace. Shalom, shalom, in Yeshua's name. His countenance upon you, and he will give you peace in Yeshua's name. Shalom, shalom, in Yeshua's name. Shalom. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you, and he will give you peace. Shalom, in Yeshua's name, shalom. Shalom, in Yeshua's name, shalom. Shalom, in Yeshua's name, Shalom. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you, and he will give you peace, and he will give you peace. Shalom. Hey yo ya, hey ya, Yahweh. Hey yo ya, hey ya, Yahweh, Yahweh, yeah. Hey yo ya, hey ya. Hey yo ya, hey ya, Yahweh, Yahweh, yeah.
All right. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and welcome. It's another Sabbath, and we are on the gates of hell. Gates of hell fail against the Sabbath keepers of church history. And we'll start out by reading the commandment in Exodus chapter 20 on the 10 commandments. Remember the Yom HaShabbat to shomer them as kadosh. That means to guard them as holy. 6 days or yamim shall you labor and do all your work, but on the 7th Yom is the Shabbat of Yahuwah your Elohim. In it you shall not do any work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, your male eved, nor your female eved, nor your cattle, nor your ger. There it is. See? Ger. Stranger. The Sabbath was intended even for the strangers. Did you catch that? Not only, as so often is stated, only for Jews, but no, it was intended for anybody, nor a convert that is within your gates. For in 6 days, or yamim, Yahuwah made the shamayim and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested on the 7th Yom. Therefore Yahuwah blessed the Shabbat Yom and set it apart. So it takes us back to creation, when the Sabbath day was established. It even predates the 10 Commandments. And let's see. I took a screenshot here from a YouTube channel called Outside the Camp. And just the reminder that the Sabbath is part of the moral law. It's not categorized as ceremonial law, even though it is a ceremony. But modern times, people try to divide up the laws into categories that are just man-made ideas and traditions. But we should remember that the Sabbath is part of the moral law. It is breaking God's moral law if we don't observe the Sabbath day. And this is just one example of that, where Nehemiah 13:17 says, Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, What evil thing is this that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath day? And the evil thing was that they bought and sold on the Sabbath. They bought and sold and did perform business transactions on the Sabbath. So that's one of the things. Business is not to be done on the Sabbath day. So that's a good start for us here. In the chat, we have Lindsay, Shabbat Shalom, Gabriel, Shabbat Shalom, Windfeather, Shabbat Shalom. Hopefully she gets back from walking the dog. Scott with 1T, Shabbat Shalom. Hey Hiya, Shabbat Shalom. All right. I think that is everybody. So we had finished up last week our study on a city upon a hill and how America was established with that type of a vision in mind. And that's part of the Sermon on the Mount, that we be a city upon a hill, similar to the New Jerusalem concept, that we are that shining light. And that was about John Winthrop, how he preached that sermon on the ship coming over here to establish the Puritan colonies in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so this got me on a tangent of wanting to return back to some history about Sabbath keeping. And let's see here. If we remember back, it was back in August, we did part 1 about churches that had changed their services from Sunday to Saturday after they realized that the Sabbath still was still in force and still applied. And we went over the gates of hell will not prevail against the church of Christ, but really that's the ecclesia in Greek, or the kahila in Hebrew, and it means the congregation or assembly. So this is the same congregation that was in the wilderness in the Old Testament, and that same assembly continued throughout as Stephen preached about the church in the wilderness. It's the assembly of Israel. And so when we graft into the family of Yah, we are part of Israel, and those are considered our fathers or ancestors, as the Apostle Paul shows in, I believe, 1 Corinthians 10. And of course, if they're our ancestors, and Abraham, the Hebrew, we're the seed of Abraham, who's called a Hebrew, then we are Hebrews. We are adopted into the family of Israel. And so in the description of the video, I've included where we started back in August. We did 6 episodes of church history, the true church history, so that you can check those out. Anybody that comes back to this video, you'll be able to find those, and I'll also be making a playlist of that, of these studies that we've done, because I think it's really important to recognize that there's always been a remnant preserved. So that's where we're at. We're on studying some of church history, and let's refresh our memories of Matthew chapter 16. says, "And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my ecclesia." And the Hebrew Matthew says house of prayer. Interestingly, it would be a direct reference to Isaiah 56 that directly references a Sabbath-keeping entity. "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And so the Catholic Church claims that Peter is their first pope and that they claim to go back to Peter. However, we've done the work to trace the true body, the true assembly of Messiah, that there were always Sabbath keepers who have been persecuted throughout history. And not only Sabbath, they kept the annual feast days. They generally observed the Torah. That goes back to the original Nazarene assembly. The sect of the Nazarenes, the followers of the way, were Sabbath observant and fully the Torah of Moshe, the law of Moses, they observed fully as well at the original Jerusalem church established at Pentecost. And where was this spoken to Peter? At Caesarea Philippi, where it was literally the gates of hell was that location with all this pagan worship. So, it was thought of as to be the gates to the underworld, and all the various pagan practices and groups were at this location. And Yahushua was saying the pagan gates of hell would not prevail against his called out assembly. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So we get to a big key. A big key is the changing of the Sabbath and recognizing that we're to maintain the Sabbath, the sign between God, Yah, and his children, to show us to be his children. Well, that sign was attempted to be changed by Rome. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So, very important to connect back to the true assembly. Of course, we know about the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 verse 21. This is the whole establishment of Messiah's body, Messiah's ecclesia, his church, that they determined what the rules would be at the Jerusalem Council, because there was a problem. There was a debate about what people had to do to be considered saved and part of the body of Messiah. For the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. So the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, chapter 15, verse 1, you see that the very start, you have to recognize the context. It says, "And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, Except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved." So the context is king, as they say. Context is king, or key, you could say. But if you miss the context, then you'll possibly twist the whole thing. So this was to be considered salvation. This was not to be considered what as you are sanctified, and where you go from that starting point forward. This was just the very starting point for new believers that were coming to Messiah. But it says, when therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. And being brought on their way by the ecclesia, they passed through Phoenice and Samaria, declaring the conversion of the Gentiles, the other nations, outside of Judea. And they caused great joy unto all the brethren, and when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received of the ecclesia and of the apostles and elders, and they declared all things that Elohim had done with them. So we see that they're coming to Jerusalem, they're declaring about the other nations or Gentiles being converted by faith in Messiah, Yahushua. And then it says, the council at Jerusalem, but there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the Torah of Moshe, or the law of Moses. And so there was this Pharisee sect that was saying in order to be truly saved, they had to be circumcised and they had to fully observe the law of Moses, or they couldn't be saved. They were unsavable, because remember, that's the context. So this is not about what you should do as a believer, what you should try to do as a saved person. This is about what you have to do to earn salvation is the topic here. The Torah of Moses, the law of Moses, is not what saves us. It's the fruit that flows out because of the fact that we're saved, that we want to obey God's law. And so let's see. Oh, we have to keep scrolling down here on this chapter, because if you really miss the Jerusalem Council, you kind of miss it all. But it says, wherefore my sentence is, and this is what James and the other apostles, who were the 12 apostles, they were more weighty. James, John, they were going to make final decisions before Paul and Barnabas were, but they were secondary apostles. My sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to Elohim. There it is, among the Gentiles. Now this always gets twisted, doesn't it? That Gentiles just, they don't, all they have to do is this right here. But that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. And how many of them really abstain from pollutions of idols? How many of them consider some of these dietary requirements? For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. And so we see that to be considered saved, according to the Jerusalem Council, the first century faith, that you had to do these immediate requirements of basically forsaking paganism, forsaking idolatry, and the practices of the pagan gods was the first thing that they had to sacrifice, And they had to have a mindset every Sabbath to come and learn Moses. Come and hear Moses preached on the Sabbath day. So the Sabbath is all about the law and the prophets. Whenever you begin keeping Sabbath, you begin learning more of the Torah, more of the law and the prophets. That was the practice, was to read the law and the prophets every Sabbath day. So to be considered a truly regenerate, born-again believer, you actually had to have the mindset that you're in repentance of the old pagan way, the heathen way, the Gentile way, and you're going to keep Sabbath. You're going to remember to keep the Sabbath day holy every Sabbath. Now, if you didn't want to do that, they would have looked at you sideways and think, what's wrong with you? That you didn't want to keep the Sabbath day holy? You didn't want to keep the 10 Commandments? Well, you must not be truly born again if you don't want to keep God's Sabbath day. And so it's not as though the Sabbath or any law saves people. It's just a sign of who is truly saved. So any people that continued breaking these basic requirements, it's not to say they can't be saved, but it's to say that the first century ecclesia or church would not have recognized them as saved. They would have delivered them up and say, okay, go continue in sin, and we desire that, deliver such an one to Satan, that in the end their soul might be saved. So you still hope for salvation for the people named a brethren or called a brother, and it doesn't mean that they're not a brother, but it would just you would recognize they're not walking in covenant or in fellowship. And so that was the Jerusalem Council. And what else do we see? They could go all over the place. There were Jewish synagogues where Moses was preached all over the inhabited world, all over Rome. How do we know that? Messiah actually told us point blank that there were places where you could go attend to hear the law of Moses preached, and this was where the apostles went throughout the inhabited world. They would go to, the first place would be the synagogues on Sabbath, because people around the world wanted to worship the Creator and obey his laws and keep the Sabbath holy, but they may have not yet heard of Messiah, and so the apostles went primarily to the Jewish synagogues that were all over. Well, Messiah said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you compass sea and land to make one proselyte." So they went over land and sea. They traveled the land and the sea to make one proselyte or one convert into Judaism and cause someone to be circumcised and observe the whole law of Moses and follow all their traditions. And it says, "And when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves." Twofold more, a son of hell. So Messiah here actually was pretty fierce, wasn't he? He was pretty hard on the religious people of his day, but he was exposing them for following traditions of men and teaching traditions of men. And down here at the bottom we see it says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the Torah," the law of Moses, "judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and not to have left the other undone." So here Messiah enforces the lesser matters of Torah. You shouldn't leave the lesser matters of Torah undone, but you should have focused more heavily on what you missed, the weightier matters of the Torah, judgment, mercy, and faith. They were neglecting those things. And the same thing at the Jerusalem Council. The Pharisees were trying to enforce circumcision and a lot of the little lesser matters of Torah on the new converts, and saying otherwise you can't be saved. It's not possible for you to be saved if you don't. So that's the type of people that are being dealt with, that Messiah had to deal with. You know, modern times people would think of Yahushua or Jesus as a Pharisee, the same way that they think that we are Pharisees on this channel. Myself have been called a Pharisee, and the people who believe the way that we do are considered Pharisees of modern times. But what is a Pharisee, biblically speaking? Because this says, today false Christians would call Jesus a Pharisee and unfriend him for his judgmental language and harsh tone. Snakes, vipers, children of hell, hypocrites, fools, blind guides, all these things that he accused the religious leaders, who were respected of his day. They were respected religious leaders. This is how he talked to them. Well, a Pharisee was essentially defined as a person who made the commandment of God of no effect for the sake of their tradition. But modern day people think that if you try to actually follow God's laws, that makes you a hypocrite, or that makes you a Pharisee. Well, no, it's actually those who follow traditions and make God's commandment of no effect. So a perfect example of that is Sunday church making the Sabbath commandment of no effect for the sake of a tradition of men, going to church on the first day of the week as opposed to remembering the seventh day of the week to keep it holy. And then Galatians chapter 1, it's important to highlight that this is what Paul was dealing with, these very same people of this religious sect. He makes this known in the book of Galatians, and this is all. Oh, sorry, hopefully that didn't mess up the stream, but this is actually the book that everyone tells us, have you read the book of Galatians, that you think people should follow the Old Testament laws. They always point us to the book of Galatians, but they twist it, not truly understanding what Paul was up against. But it says, the whole false gospel. I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. And the false gospel, the perversion of the gospel, was essentially, it was this circumcision party that said that you had to be circumcised to be saved. We saw that the Jerusalem Council, the other apostles, determined that you didn't have to be circumcised and keep the whole law of Moses to be considered saved. But that was who he was dealing with. These same people that Messiah dealt with in Matthew 23, the same people that the Jerusalem Council met with and dealt with in Acts chapter 15. If you don't understand that, you'll think that you'll think that just anything Jewish is wrong, and that you should not follow the Torah of Moses, and that you shouldn't keep the Sabbath day holy. But so it says they pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed. And so the contrast, again, was the false gospel was you had to be circumcised and keep the Torah of Moses to be saved. The true gospel was that you didn't have to be circumcised and keep the whole law of Moses to be saved, but that you would have to have a mindset to learn the law of Moses with a period and process of growth and sanctification. Every Sabbath you would have a mindset to learn the Torah of Moses, the law of Moses. That was the true gospel. That's what the book of Galatians is dealing with. And here it is in the next chapter, Galatians chapter 2. You see what? The council at Jerusalem, the Jerusalem council. Paul tells people point blank. How many people catch this, that he's referring back to the Jerusalem council of Acts chapter 15? Not many, but it says, then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. So, and also in Galatians 1, it says that Paul first went out into the wilderness. He went out into Damascus and out in the Dead Sea Scrolls area, the community that was known to be the followers of the way. So Paul actually spent time learning about the followers of the way, of which he was said to be a ringleader of the followers of the way, of the sect of the Nazarenes. And we know that the followers of the way obviously kept the Sabbath. They were fully Torah observant. That's after Paul became officially a follower of the way, after Messiah appeared to him in his vision, then this happened, the Jerusalem Council. And I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run, them which are of reputation was the 12 apostles, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So there it is. You get into this whole idea of the circumcision that the Jerusalem Council dealt with. And that because of false brethren, there we go, false brethren, unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Yahushua, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But of these who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. Elohim accepteth no man's person, for they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me, but contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. For he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. And then it goes into James and John, the pillars of the faith, who he dealt with back at the Jerusalem Council. We know that the book of Galatians is written for the whole purpose of those who were subverters of souls and twisting the gospel and preaching a different gospel, was that they were saying that the Galatians, the foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you? Well, they were bewitched by the circumcision party, who said that you can't be saved if you're an uncircumcised person. You can't be saved if you're not fully Torah observant, all the jots and tittles, and basically that you come into Judaism, which Messiah showed that they made the commandment of no effect for the sake of their traditions. So all the same Pharisees. So modern times Pharisees would be Sunday churchianity, lots of unbiblical traditions that make Torah laws of no effect. If you miss that, what will you do? You'll follow the book of Galatians and not follow the rest of the Bible. And you'll basically only follow a few of Paul's letters, which were written to select individuals in select locations. And you'll negate the commandments of God. That was the false gospel. The true gospel was, no, none of that saved you. Just come every Sabbath, have a mindset, read the law and the prophets. You'll learn as you go. That was the true gospel. And so to some quotes. Here's a quote of history. For although almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week, yet the Christians of Alexandria and at Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this. So all the early 1st century and beyond churches were keeping the Sabbath. They were observing the Sabbath, not Sunday, except for Alexandria and Rome. And Alexandria is a primary location of sun god worship. Helios, the sun sun god. And the same with Rome. So these were places of Mithraism and pagan sun god worship. And it says that this was an ancient tradition. This was a quote by Socrates Scholasticus, a historian, what a name, 379 to 450 AD. Made this quote. So an important quote that actually shows this to be rather accurate, that there was an ancient pagan tradition to worship their pagan sun gods on the first day of the week. But early believers kept Saturday as the Sabbath until March 7th, 321 Common Era. That's Constantine. And of course, there were councils there that enforced this. First, the Council of Nicaea, and then the Council of Laodicea kind of solidified this within the Church of Rome. And then Rome would spread their doctrine and dominate the rest of the inhabited world to enforce Sunday worship, or try to. Pope Constantine passed a law requiring believers to worship on Sunday, the day the pagans worship the sun god. So that's a very hard thing to accept, because most Sunday churches would say, well, we honor the resurrection of Christ. Well, no, you really don't. You're actually honoring an ancient tradition of the pagans, because you're not walking in covenant, you're not obeying God, you're making the commandment of God of no effect for the sake of a man-made tradition that began with pagan sun god worship. Believers still kept Saturday as the Sabbath until another law was passed 11 years later. This law was signed into decree by Pope Constantine. Pope Constantine forbid believers to worship on the Sabbath, because Constantine wasn't a pope. And it was punishable by death by the Catholic Church. Many believers were burned to death by the Catholic Church for keeping the Sabbath. And that's true. They murdered the people who were Sabbath keepers. And we've been over the Waldenses and how they fled for their lives and lived in the French Alps, etc. But they were of the original apostolic first century faith, and probably established directly by the apostles. So here's a quote from the book The Sabbath World, Judith Shulevitz. Whenever people begin reading the book, they start keeping the Sabbath, and when they keep the Sabbath, they read the book. That's what you're supposed to do on the Sabbath. You're supposed to read Torah portions. Isn't that the case? That's the tradition. So let's keep going here. Let's see here. Here we come to some quotes from history. Some did indeed draw the obvious conclusion, though there is no evidence any acted correctly upon it for some years. For the Old Chambers Encyclopedia, the article Sabbath declares, accordingly in the reign of Elizabeth, so this gets us back towards the Puritans, what we were talking about last Sabbath. The reign of Elizabeth in 1558 to 1603, it occurred to many conscientious and independent thinkers that the fourth commandment required of them the observance not of the first, but of the specified seventh day of the week. And so this is the Chambers Encyclopedia. You see how there were plenty, even though the Puritans primarily were keeping Sunday Sabbath from Saturday sunset to Sunday sunset, and they did keep it as a no work, a literal Sabbath, but they believed that the Sabbath was transferred, so they didn't yet have all their facts straight. But you can appreciate that they at least wanted to throw out work and business, because in the Anglican Church of England, they were doing worldly business and work even on Sunday. And so they wanted to make it a true day of rest. However, there were many people among them and those who came to America in the colonial days that were reconsidering and that were wanted to observe the seventh day as opposed to the first day of the week. That just goes to show you how strong indoctrination can be. The other problem with the Puritans was that they were not really abiding in religious freedom, as they were forcing everybody to have to attend Sunday church. And their whole government was centered around the church. And so you can see how the beast was very much present in early America. And the whole city on a hill concept. But the emergence of the seventh day keepers, and the Chambers Encyclopedia was written, it's a very important history of England and the Puritans and all that, and it was written in the 1800s. So here comes the emergency in history of Seventh-day keepers. Seventh-day Baptists trace their origin back to 17th century England. But actually, the earliest known English-speaking keepers of the seventh day were Puritans. So the Baptists, this is pretty cool to me because I grew up Baptist, but the original Baptists were more than, most likely, they were Sabbath keepers on the seventh day of the week. But John Traskey, stentorian voice Puritan preacher from the west of England, is the first famous name. He and his wife, both school teachers, had the true Sabbath pointed out to them shortly after moving to London in 1617 by Hamlet Jackson, whom Traskey later ordained one of 4 evangelists. But all things did not go well for long. Both Traskeys were imprisoned for Judaizing. See, they'll always call it Judaizing. Contrary to the practice of the established religion, Mrs. Traskey remained in prison 16 years till her death. Mr. Traskey at least partially recanted of keeping the annual feast days of the Old Testament. So you see that always along with this, with Sabbath keeping, it restores other laws, the annual Sabbaths, the feast days as well. And was released after 3 years, but ever afterward, as various mentions in state papers show, continued under suspicion of Sabbath keeping until he also died. And so you see that the persecution was quite heavy on people. You were either imprisoned, even in the early days, in the U.S., you could be banned from the Massachusetts Bay Colony area and just the whole state of Massachusetts, as they made it enforced law to keep Sunday. And this is where actually Roger Williams comes in. Let's see, is that the next? Rhode Island. So Rhode Island and Roger Williams come in. No wonder then that Roger Williams, fleeing from Massachusetts to found Rhode Island, was soon joined by many others, and that their religious liberty was brought forth on the American continent. Rhode Island became a haven for the persecuted Baptists. To Rhode Island came Stephen Mumford in 1664 from London, bringing the Saturday Sabbath, and there he persuaded others, who became the first true Sabbath-keeping church in America in 1671. And so Rhode Island, interestingly, was founded for true religious freedom. Unfortunately, in the Puritan circles in Massachusetts and in those areas, you really didn't have religious freedom. It was just whatever the Puritans said, that's what goes. Sunday worship. Of course, Christmas was illegal. Roger Williams didn't fit in. He was a Puritan preacher who he said that he even allowed for atheists and people that just were unbelievers. He didn't think that you could just force religion on people, that's not true religious freedom if you force it. So Roger Williams went to Rhode Island, and Rhode Island was really more of true religious freedom where, it wouldn't, the separation of church and state. So separation of the government and religion were separated. Let's see. So who was Roger Williams? The first Baptist preacher in America, establishing the First Baptist Church in Providence, Rhode Island in 1638. But he was a Puritan before that. Let's see. He held religious services in his home for almost a year before converting his congregation into a Baptist church. And we've actually been over the Anabaptists, but the Anabaptists were most likely, for the most part, Seventh-day Sabbath observers. Another that modern-day Baptist churches, that goes undetected on the radar. But if you're really a true original Baptist, you would keep the Seventh-day Sabbath holy. The first Baptist preacher in America who was a Sabbath keeper would most likely be associated with the Seventh-day Baptist movement, with prominent early figures like Roger Williams being mentioned as a potential candidate, although his denomination did not explicitly practice Sabbath keeping as a core doctrine. However, some within his early Baptist communities may have held Seventh-day Sabbath beliefs. So the point of it is that Roger Williams, beginning as a Puritan, no doubt began as a Sunday church observer because of the Anglican Church, which was connected to Rome. But as time went on, and we know that one John Cotton, another Puritan influential person in Massachusetts, actually wrote a treatise or a little pamphlet or booklet to respond to the Sabbath keepers about the seventh day, why he made the claim that the Sabbath the solemnity of the Sabbath was transferred from the seventh day to the first day. So an early Puritan actually wrote that, and that alone, that a Puritan would write a little booklet or pamphlet to try and prove the Sabbath being transferred to the first day of the week, that proves that there was the other side that was saying, no, we need to observe the true Sabbath. So in early colonial America, the seventh-day Sabbath was very much present and was a very big part of the Protestant Reformation, but it goes kind of unmentioned most of the time. Let's see. The Sabbath Recorder of June 11th, 1868 says, in 1552, many in England were known as Sabbatarians. Luther himself, this is Martin Luther, known for the 95 Theses, hammered on the wall of the Catholic Church, or on the door. While it is said, believed in, and practiced the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, did not prescribe it in his articles of faith for his followers, in the copies that we now have access to. However, it has been said that in his original thesis, Luther advocated the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, but that his colleagues objected on the grounds that it was an unpopular doctrine which would have a tendency to repulse supporters of the Reformation who were not as pious as they should have been, but were of great assistance against the usurpations of the papacy. Of course, we remember Luther, famous for salvation by grace alone through faith alone. Salvation by grace through faith in Christ alone. And sola scriptura, only what's written in Scripture should be followed. And so that, of course, includes the seventh-day Sabbath and excludes the first day of the week, Sunday church. Most people only point to Martin Luther's early life, but it seems that possibly at the end of Martin Luther's life, he embraced the true Sabbath, which I think this is phenomenal to find out. But Luther, in his works, has written of his belief in the Sabbath as follows: the Sabbath was before the law of Moses came. We already said that once today. And has existed from the beginning of the world. That's just in the commandment of Exodus 20, that God sanctified it and rested the seventh day of creation. Especially have the devout who have preserved the true faith met together and called upon God on this day. So that's Martin Luther's work. There were actually a couple of quotes I wanted to find that would, I just wasn't able to take the time to find some of the quotes I wanted to find that proves the Sabbath was, there were Sabbath observing synagogues all throughout the world. But Messiah's words are enough that the Pharisees traveled land and sea to establish Jewish synagogues. Let's see here. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in the fall of 1620, who are mentioned on other pages of this work, and in the fall of 1638, the English became acquainted with the coast along Connecticut to the west, and on page 123 of Ridpath's History of the United States, we read as follows of their settlement here. Here some men of Boston tarried over a winter, built cabins, and founded New Haven, Connecticut. Thither in April came a Puritan colony from England, led by Theophilus Eaton and John Davenport. On the first Sabbath after their arrival, they met for worship under an oak, and Davenport preached a touching sermon on the temptations in the wilderness. How remarkable it is that these people, understanding the prophecies of the church being in the wilderness until the year 1798, and that goes back to the book of Revelation, chapter 12, and on the Sabbath day having a discourse on the subject. So the earth helped the woman in the wilderness is the prophecy that refers to there. So that was from a history of the true church traced from 33 AD to date by Andrew Duggar and Clarence Dodd, and that was in the 1930s. Now, they traced the Sabbath keeping assembly, not only Sabbath, but other laws of Moses, all the way from the 1st century all the way through. And we've been over a couple sources that have done that, how the true church, the gates of hell never prevailed against the true Sabbath-keeping, Torah-observant ecclesia. That's mostly it. There was this one more thing, but I don't think that they got this accurate. However, this does exist. Some Church of God history, John Quiche, and he says how, let's see, Sabbath keepers in America can be traced to early colonial days, which that is true. It is evident that there were Seventh-day observers among those who landed on the American shores when they arrived on the Mayflower in 1620. So it makes the case that that the true Sabbath was represented on the Mayflower. However, I don't know if that was true, but this particular article did make that case. So I'll show it, but I'm not going to read it because I think it's really more likely that the Puritans on the Mayflower were still Sunday observers. However, we know that the belief of the true Sabbath, there were many considering that fact, and they ended up in Rhode Island primarily. Let's see, I guess that pretty much, I think that pretty much wraps it up. Seems as though I was going to say something else. And now I forget what it was. So we've gone off on a little tangent from the New Jerusalem and jumped back to, this would be part 7 of the true church history of Christ. We've now done 7 parts on that. Before Feast of Trumpets and Tabernacles, then we began to go off into New Jerusalem because these ideas and concepts are connected. But that's it. A little bit shorter today. I hope that encourages everyone that actually There are a couple more slides I had. Let's see, here's one. Of course, always accusing of Judaizing if you tell people to not eat pork and obey God's law and keep the Sabbath day holy. So I'll just throw these couple slides from the early English. Published a little book on the Sabbath, 1728, which was so effective that the congregation now publicly adopted the Sabbath as the day for divine services. Before this, the meetings were held on Sunday and the Sabbath celebrated in quiet. So we see how that these examples, we've seen plenty of them when people really, they read the Bible, they return to Sabbath, and when they keep the Sabbath, they read the book, because that's what's biblical. The Sabbath is mentioned more times than thou shalt not lie or steal. It's the most repeated commandment over and over throughout Scripture is the Sabbath. So, y'all bless everyone and Shabbat Shalom. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Blessings in Yahushua's name. Great Sabbath study. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Lindsay. I do appreciate that. And Yah bless everyone.